So I think the mic, you don't, I think it'll pick you up just fine.
Okay.
If that's okay.
Great.
I think you should be good.
All right. Okay, hello, everyone. My name is Chris, and as Dr. Glazier just said, I'm a PhD candidate at Rice University, but this semester been generously given guess one research fellowships. But I'm in the library at West Georgia, just looking through one of the primary operators from the Stargate program, a man named Ingo Swann. More about him in a second. I'm writing my doctoral dissertation on this program that ran from 1972 to 1995. Officially, it was referred to as the U.S. Cognitive Sciences Program, but it was a secret program during its time running. It was declassified in 1995. Knows about it now, and a lot of the personnel go around giving talks, and a lot of them have written books and things about it. Most of the documents, from what I'm told, are declassified now. There are one or two still holding back, but I'm writing my doctoral dissertation about it, and I thought I would come talk to you today a little bit. So this is really a parapsychological research program, and Dr. Glazier said he had already gone over this a little bit, but I thought it was worth mentioning that just the origins of psychology here. So the field itself, the field itself was founded by a married couple. Both of them had PhDs in botany. But they got really interested in psychic research and the paranormal whenever they were both graduate students at the University of Chicago together, Joseph Banks and Louisa Rhine, and they attended a speech one night, just a talk being given by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Does anybody recognize that name? He wrote Sherlock Holmes. He was also really interested in spiritualism. Have y'all gone over spiritualism any?
Not a little bit, maybe.
Okay, so this idea that was very popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm sure you've seen at some point during a movie, the seances, everybody sits around a table, hands on the table, and suddenly it starts moving around and everything, and we think it's ghost. Maybe, maybe not. But Arthur Conan Doyle was really convinced that this was ghosts, that these were spirits of the dead who returned to talk to the living. So J.B. Rhine and his wife, Louisa, attend this lecture one night, and they are captivated. They decide that, they're going to finish up their degrees in botany, but this is really what they want to study for the rest of their lives. And they do a little bit more research and studying at Harvard, just kind of retool with some psychology of the time. And they end up in the psychology department at Duke University around 1930. And whenever they're there, they really take the phenomena that's been studied this whole time around seances and spiritualism, which is kind of a religion, and they wonder, we should bring this into the laboratory and try to make this as routinized and as experimental as possible. And they talked to a man named Carl Zinner. He was a perceptual psychologist, and they collaborate with him to design a test to test people for extrasensory perception. And they asked Dr. Zinner to come up with a set of cards with symbols on them that will be the easiest possible for a person to perceive. And he designs these. They're called the Zinner cards, or ESP cards. And they start using these 5 cards. There's 5 of each in each deck. And plus, if so the average person, they discover over hundreds of thousands of trials. They run these card tests for the next like 50 years at Duke University. Thousands of students participate. And they realize that the average person over a period of time will do approximately 20%. And statistically significant is considered plus or minus 5%. So if you get either direction, about 5%, they think that's a little bit strange and they want to run more tests, essentially. So they did run across a few people who seemed to be able to just nail every single test they threw at them, but that was fairly rare. So this is really how it gets started. It gets started at Duke University, parapsychology does, and it sort of filters out from there. And by the 1960s, there's a number of these research institutions in the United States, a couple in Europe, I believe, by that point. And also, there's a number of them going on in the Soviet Union. And what's going on in the 1960s between the US and the Soviet Union? They're best friends, right? Right? No, it's something called the Cold War. And it lasted for a really long time. And the Soviet Union, now known as Russia, and the United States were not good friends. They were very scared of each other. And another thing, while J.B. Rhine is kind of working out parapsychology in the laboratory in the United States in the 1930s and 1940s, what's going on in Europe around this time? World War II, exactly. And the rise of the Nazi Germany. They are committing horrible, horrible atrocities in Europe. But some of the Nazi scientists are also really interested in the paranormal, and they're studying it, and they're trying to do sort of a quasi-scientific endeavor there. And what happens after World War II with the Nazi scientists? It's pretty bad. Some of the Nazi scientists who committed just unspeakable atrocities are recruited by the Soviet and the United States governments, and they're relocated to Russia and to the United States. So the United States mostly takes, the engineers and the physicists and the rocket guys who end up getting us to the moon in the 1960s. But they kind of ignored the psychical researchers, from what I understand. And the Soviet Union took those and put them to work. And around the time the United States was going to the moon in the late 1960s, some of the former Nazi psychical researchers have really gotten a lot of funding from the Soviet Union government, and now they're developing mind control. So as happens in the geopolitical world, reports start coming in to agencies in the United States, such as the CIA, the NSA, those kinds of places, that are reporting that, the Soviet Union is running mind control and experiments, and they're having some success with it. So very quietly, a few of the, a few operatives go around to, some psychologists and psychiatrists, mainstream professionals in the mental health community, and they're just kind of like, hey, mind control, that's not a thing, right? They can't do that, right? And most of them are like, no, that's not possible. Psychic stuff has been mostly disproven. Well, but there's all of these parapsychology labs going, and in 1969, they're accepted into the American Academy for the Advancement of Science. Parapsychology is starting to get more and more of a good name. And some of the former intelligence professionals have started entering this community, particularly a man named Hal Puthoff, who was a physicist He earns his PhD in physics from, I believe, Stanford University. But before that, he actually worked for the NSA as an analyst. There's another man named Cleve Baxter, who was an interrogations expert for the CIA. And then he retired in the 1960s. And by the 1970s, he's just gotten really into parapsychology. And so they start hearing about these reports in the early 1970s, and they have a very different perspective. They think, you know, this actually might be something that we should be concerned about. You know, if the Soviets can do this, then especially since they're trying to do mind control, you know, we don't want them to be able to maybe subtly manipulate politicians, global leaders. What happens whenever they start putting thoughts in the president's head? And that's definitely a concern to these kinds of agencies. So they decide to go on the hunt for their own psychic. And they meet a man named Ingo Swann, who we'll talk more about his first time, which just kind of blows everyone away. But he can steadily he can replicate these types of phenomena. Maybe not the mind control just yet, but he can do the psychic test in the laboratory. He can sit in a laboratory in, say, New York City, and he can tell you what's going on in different cities around the globe. And whenever you check in with the people in that area, well, it turns out he's right. Particularly with weather reports is how they first tested him. What's the weather like in wherever? And he would tell them. So that by 1972, they put together a program. They give about $500,000 to Hal Puthoff, Ingo Swann, and another man gets involved named Russell Targ. They just want to know, you know, what's the extent of this? And that leads to an actual official tasking a few years later. So the first thing they do is they want to know that this stuff works, that there actually are people in the world who can sit in, by this point, they're in California, who can sit in California and tell me what's going on across the world at a military facility that we can't get into. So the very first thing is simply establishing the validity of psi phenomena. They do this pretty quickly. It's pretty obvious very quickly that Ingo Swann is unique in a lot of ways. The second thing is that they evaluated information gathered about foreign parapsychological research and operations. Again, the Soviet Union actually did this first. And before them, it was Nazi Germany. So there's a lot of countries in the world by the 1970s. The United States is not alone. A lot of militaries across the world are looking into this. Russia, China, Germany's program, I believe, shut down after World War II because, you know, the country got split up and the Cold War started. But also, I know there was Austria-Hungary. There's several places in the world where governments are interested in this phenomena because it has obvious utility to any kind of military organization. So the third thing that they get tasked with here is trying to find, you know, how does this work? Where are these kinds of operations going on in the brain or in the body? What's happening here? And they spend a lot of money and they employ a lot of really advanced technologies over the year. And they get some really interesting results from that, but they never really cracked this. To this day, nobody really understands exactly how these things are being processed in the brain. Though we have come a long way, have some good theories. We'll get back to that in a moment. So the other thing that they do, and this is pretty early on, is they want to find ways of identifying people within the rank and file of the military who might have these kinds of abilities. So again, this is still a secret program. It's not declassified until 1995. It runs for 23 years. So they can't just like walk up to people and say, hey, do you think you might be psychic? You want to come join the top secret psychic program we got over here? They can't do that. So they need ways of, being able to task certain people who have very high level security clearances, just kind of telling them what to look for as they're interacting with their troops on a day-to-day basis. And they do a lot of that, particularly psychological testing becomes really useful in this area, they think. And also they just kind of develop ways of looking for certain things that kind of cue that a person might be psychically sensitive. And we'll talk more about that. But the most important thing that they do, I guess, is they actually deployed psychic phenomena for military and intelligence and law enforcement operations. For 23 years, a whole slew of agencies, the DEA, the CIA, Army, the Navy, just tons of them are giving money and calling up the psychics and going, hey, can you help me out with something? And there's literally thousands of operations that get run, hundreds of personnel are doing it, and they're developing programs, training programs, materials that can actually teach people how to do it and how to do it better. And they're always trying to refine these techniques over the course of 20 years. So very early in the program, they divide it. You have the operations, which mostly take place at a military base in Fort Meade, Maryland. And you have research and development going on in Palo Alto, California at SRI International, which still exists, by the way. SRI does, and it's still pretty active. Not in these areas, but they still do a lot of research there. Oh, and this is a picture of me with one of the former psychic spies, a man named Paul Smith. And over here is the research director who was with the program from 1975 to 1985, a man named Dr. Edwin C. May. At the Parapsychological Association annual meeting, I think this was in 19, we met in Paris. It was a lovely trip. So Dr. May generously donated his papers with all of the classified materials to Rice University a few years ago. And I was one of the team members who went through them and organized them and processed them and got them ready so that they're now open to the public at Rice University. So I've gotten to know him fairly well, and it was really nice to see him in person. So the first thing that they try to do in the research and operations side, or on the operational side, is they want to find out if they can use psycho, which they also sanitized all of the traditional names for psychic research, because you can't go to Congress and ask for $1 million to research psychics. So they tried to come up with terminology and just rename everything so it sounded more sciencey. So they call psychokinesis remote action, because your remote target that you're trying to influence through action. So it's remote action. And the original thinking here was that they could use this. It's always a very weak, particularly at a distance. It's typically a very weak interaction with a physical system that you're trying to manipulate psychically. So they probably couldn't like melt tank barrels and cause jets to fall out of the sky. That would have been really cool, but they decided that they couldn't really do that early on. But they always held out hope that they could actually manipulate computer systems and basically just cause the Russians' computers to fail. So maybe they couldn't launch nuclear bombs at us. So the thing that really sets them off and gets a few people's hopes up early on in the program is actually the very first experiment they run with Joe Swan. They bring him into the lab in California and they say, we have something on the other side of that steel and lead reinforced 20 feet thick, I'm not sure it was 20 feet, I forget the exact dimensions, of a concrete wall. We have something on the other side of it and we want you to describe it. Well, it turns out that it was a magnetometer, just this really advanced device, or at least it was advanced in 1972, that registers electromagnetic fields. And he starts describing it and he starts drawing it. And as he's doing this, the magnetometer starts just going off the charts, kind of a little haywire. And it seems like he's interacting with it as he's describing it. And they think, oh, well, there's some kind of electromagnetic something going on here. And, that can really screw up computer chips. And wouldn't it be great if we could fry Soviet computer chips from California? They're in Russia. So they start researching that. It turns out that it's really hard to control. Some people may have been able to do it. They keep researching it for the next 2 years. But it's very difficult to control that. However, they do realize that not most, but some people with natural psychic abilities seem to interact with their environment on an unconscious level. And actually, Dr. William Roll, who used to be a professor in the psychology department at University of West Georgia, did a lot of research in this area, developing his theory that he called recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. So the idea here is that a person with greater than average psychic sensitivity, usually they don't know that they're psychic because those don't exist in our culture. But that doesn't mean that they aren't. And sometimes their minds will start to interact with the environment. So you get a lot of bumps and knocks and objects randomly flying across the room or something like this. And historically speaking, a lot of the times, and even today, typically the person does not know that they're the ones doing it. So it usually gets attributed to just kind of whatever's laying around in local folklore. Ghosts, demons, jinn, occasionally angels. But Dr. Roll believed, and a lot of people since Dr. Roll believed, that this is actually a human agent centered process. So again, what that they did during Stargate was to kind of keep an eye on the literature of parapsychology over the years. And they were looking for ways that they might be able to tell if the rank and file military service member might be useful for this secret program that's running. And one of the ways they do that is some of the officers are tasked with watching for might be RSPK being generated by certain military service members. And they find this in a man named Lynn Buchanan. Sergeant Lynn Buchanan was working in Germany, West Germany, in the early 1980s. And he's working with computers again. Remember, they're trying to screw up Soviet computers. He's with computers in West Germany in the early 1980s. And one night he's showing off to a bunch of really top level officials, like generals from multiple countries, showing off some software. One of the ones that would eventually kind of give birth to a lot of our internet technologies of today. Very rudimentary because it's the early 1980s. So he's showing this off. And one of his kind of rivals in the military had messed with the software a little bit so it wouldn't work quite right. During this big presentation he had to all of these big officials. And whenever the program started screwing up, he got really, really angry. And oftentimes RSPK will manifest whenever the agent's mental state is disturbed. And Lynn had been dealing with this his entire life. He gets mad, things fall off the wall, things fly across the room, as is pretty typical in these kinds of cases. And that night he gets really angry and all of the military computers shut off throughout the entire base. He crashed them all with his mind. Well, one of the, I think it was one of the lieutenants, one of the guys who was in attendance that night, supposed to be watching the computer display, had been tasked to look for just this phenomenon, because they knew that could indicate someone might be psychic in the. And Lynn kind of met a few of the other psychological profile that they had been looking at, and he ends up being recruited to the program. So that's just one instance of, using things within the parapsychological literature that they had been monitoring to tell whether or not someone might be psychic. So at first, and Lynn gets recruited and they put him to work trying to crash Soviet computer systems, but it never works out. But he does learn remote viewing. And another thing that they look for, before we get to the actual remote viewing stuff, another thing that they look for over the years is people who seem to have visions or hallucinations, don't seem to have like mental, like serious psychological problems, but they seem to have had, say, a near-death experience, or they occasionally report seeing some kind of vision or having some sort of intuition, like they're hearing something that nobody else says. They realize also very early on that this might be one of the things to look for to tell people who might have great psychic sensitivity. And they actually find a number of people who serve with a program like this. Ingo Swann has all kinds of visionary experiences through the years. He just seems to be a magnet for this kinds of stuff. Another man named Joe McMoneagle, and also another man named Dr. David Morehouse, both of whom served with the unit, both had near-death experiences. So they had some tragic event happen. They almost died. They met angels. God. Joe McMoneagle reports meeting God. Dr. David Morehouse reports meeting a number of angels. And they realized over the years that it's one of the things to look for. So they also get brought into the program and become remote viewers. So remote viewing, what is it? How does it work? Well, we don't know how it works, but we do know what it is. And there's a few different types. So the biggest type is what we would traditionally call clairvoyance. This is the ability to see or describe a location which is hidden either by distance or shielding. So this is one example up here, included on the slide. The remote viewer was tasked with seeing and describing this cabin that's in the woods. It's a very scenic mountain range. So they had never seen this picture. They had never been to this location. All they were given was a random 6-digit number. And on this side is what they came up with. And as you can see, remarkably accurate, right? So that's an example of remote viewing, which is done. And they do this a lot over the years. This is actually the most widely deployed thing that they do, is they'll be tasked with a random 6-digit number, and then they'll generate remarkably accurate descriptions and drawings of location that matches that random 6-digit number. And the only thing about the 6-digit number, the only thing tying it to the location is just that some analyst at some intelligence agency or something like that said this 6-digit number is for this location. Otherwise, it's completely random. There's absolutely nothing tying it to the location at all, other than someone just said it. That was the location. That was the address, so to speak. Frequently, though, this leads to the ability called bilocation in the literature. So while a person is, and these are some wild stories that tell. So essentially one guy actually used to tell, I heard him talk at an IRVA conference a couple of years ago about how he used to leave his body at his office in the Pentagon. About once a month, he would fly over to the Kremlin, which is the capital of Russia, and he would just kind of walk around and see what he could see. And he would never leave his office, but he somehow was able to project his consciousness to the other side of the world. And this happens with some frequency. They actually realized relatively quickly during the program that whenever a person starts describing a location, they can start being there more and more. And this is one of the ways that they do this is by bilocation. You start seeing it, you start talking about it, you start drawing it, and suddenly you're there, or at least your mind is there, some part of you is there. Your body is still sitting at a military base in Fort Meade, telling everyone what's going on at, the Chinese nuclear blast. So this is deployed, again, thousands of times during the program to observe military bases and operations in all of the bad guys during the Cold War that you would expect, kind of the usual suspects that you would expect them to be looking in on: the Soviet Union, Iran, North Korea, China, so on and so forth. The best operative trained by the program, probably the best at this, other than Ingo Swann, who again invented it, was a man named Joseph McMoneagle. And he's still around, and he's written several books about his experiences, and even has a how-to book if you're interested in learning to do it yourself. They gave him a medal, the Legion of Merit Medal, for providing information unavailable from any other source over 200 times, and that was just him. So really, really interesting stuff there. Then one of the other things they realized, so again, it starts with the viewing. A person is actually able to start describing a site. And then once they get into that, they started realizing that they could interact with the targets to some degree. And this gets into some of the more interesting stuff, you might say, such as telepathy, mind-to-mind interaction. So one of the remote viewers, Lynn Buchanan, writes in his memoir how he first realized this by accident. So he was tasked with remote viewing and telepathically reading a drug kingpin in South America. And so he goes to work one day. They say, "Hey, we need you to, check in on this drug lord down in South America who's been doing lots of bad stuff. We need to know what he's planning." So Lynn, of course, does his job, accesses the drug lord, tells his superiors, what this guy's doing and so on and so forth, what he might be doing in the next few days. And he goes home. And on his drive home, he's just kind of, in his truck driving home to his house, and he starts, kind of daydreaming, thinking about what he has to do that night. Oh yeah, well, I have to, what was it? Oh, I have to mow the yard, and think I'll grill a steak, and then I'll kill my wife. Oh, what? Wait, what? Kill my wife? no, no. Well, it turns out that the drug kingpin killed his wife. And it sort of cues him that there's a two-way communication going on. Not only is he seeing this person, but he's really mixing with the target's thought as he's doing this. And he's kind of taking it home with him, even to some degree. He never killed his wife, thank God. But they start realizing this. And then they start utilizing it. The last known time that they telepathically accessed anyone was Saddam Hussein during the first Gulf War in 1991. Apparently, they were some of the remote viewers were tasked with checking in and reading Saddam Hussein's mind every day just to see what he was going to do, because, you know, it was a war and they needed what the leader of the other country they were at war with was going to do. Some of the earliest is in prison interrogations. So the idea here was that if you catch a KGB operating in the United States in the 1970s, and you know, these guys are hard, right? They're not going to talk under pressure. So how can you maybe get in and find out, you know, the information that this guy might know, and maybe even getting talking a little bit? Well, they would task one of the remote viewers with doing that. And again, they would start by remote viewing him. That would lead to, from what I've heard, it's almost like starting a conversation with a person's unconscious mind. And you know, they can be very subtly influenced to maybe talk a little bit more than they actually did under ordinary circumstances. The Soviet Union really did a lot of research in this area. Remember, that's why the Americans actually first got concerned, was because of the Soviet research in this area. So the Soviets were doing this. America doesn't really get on this part of it until the late 70s or early 80s. Also on the Soviet side, they start trying to develop computers that will do it, essentially. So like actual mechanical hardware. And this is kind of difficult to describe, but it's called psychotronics. Basically, the idea there was that psychic energies might be able to be stored or even manipulated by machines. And the Soviets just poured millions of dollars into developing these kinds of machines over the years. Most of them don't work or didn't work. According to the people who built them, some did. And it's some really fascinating research there. Also, if you look at the remote influencing material on the American side, Lynn Buchanan has done a lot of work in this area. It mostly occurs through mental symbolism. So one of the things that they realized very early on is that these are unconscious psychological processes. So the unconscious mind is not thinking in words. It's not thinking in words and math. Most of the reasoning abilities in your brain are on the figuratively, say, the left side of the brain. The unconscious mind is thinking more in symbolism. It's much more connected to embodiment processes. So a lot of the influence occurs through symbolism and manipulating emotional state. So a person who's feeling more comfortable in a situation might talk more, for instance, interrogation. So that's really how that's one of the ways that's going on in the 1980s. And then there is probably the strangest part of already an extremely weird topic, is the extraterrestrial connection. So in 1973, remember the program just started in 1972. In 1973, Ingo Swann is one of the only psychics working at this time. This is before they started, just hundreds of people. So Ingo's getting kind of bored in 1973 because they keep letting him to describe the weather in other cities instead of, letting him do the really cool stuff like spy on the Russians. And want to test to see how far psychic abilities might be able to extend. Well, this is the early 70s. The space race is going, and they've just sent one of the first mechanical space probes to Jupiter in 1902. And they first started receiving information from the Jupiter space probe in 1973. So if I'm remembering correctly, about a week or so before the information from the space probe that they sent to Jupiter, NASA, they bring Ingo Swann into the laboratory and ask him to just, what do you see on Jupiter? And he starts describing it. Stuff that wasn't, some of the stuff is actually known about Jupiter yet. They don't find out until a week later when they start processing the information from the space probe. Ingo just nails it, as he always did, it seemed. And that starts keeping them, oh, you can go to space? It doesn't seem to be, the remote viewing does not seem to be limited by space-time, the same ways that we are typically used to in day-to-day life. So they keep doing these experiments, and he ends up remote viewing Mars and Mercury in the laboratory. And then he wrote this book. It wasn't published until 1998, I think. Penetration. And in this book, he describes a situation in 1976 where he was approached by a special team from an intelligence agency who would never tell him what intelligence agency. They would never tell him their real names. But he was initially contacted by someone, he says a very high-level official who was familiar with his work in the Washington, D.C. area, calls him up one night and says, oh, he would never give the name of the high-level official either, and says, hey, I want you to meet this guy. His name is not Axelrod, but you can call him Axel in DC. And he goes and he meets with him. And they put him in a car and they drive for a little while, and then they hand him a bag and say, put this bag on your head. And they carry him a little further. He ends up at what he's pretty sure was a helicopter pad, but again, he had a bag on his head by this point. Long story longer, he ends up what he was pretty sure was an underground bunker, but again, the bag on the head. And they ask him to remote view the moon, the dark side of the side that faces away from the Earth. And according to Ingo Swann, some extraterrestrials had set up a base there, and he was tasked with it to who he didn't know and wouldn't tell them who they were or who they were with. He had access to like high-level officials in Washington, D.C. in an underground bunker, so they must have been somewhat important. In 1977, he meets the same team again, who take him on a, this is another wild story from these days. They meet him at SRI. He's going to lunch, and he just kind of sees one of these people hanging out by the bathrooms, kind of pointing to the bathroom. So he follows him in. And the guy goes, oh, you were going to lunch. Yeah, gonna need you to just make up something to tell your friends and meet me up in a few minutes. So Ingo's like, okay. So he walks back to the scary. And he says, "Hey guys, just remembered I'm out of town. Okay, thanks, bye." And walks out to the parking lot. Guy's in a Jeep, he gets in the Jeep, they drive to the airport. They get on a plane. I want to say the plane had no windows, and they take off and they fly somewhere. He's pretty sure it was Alaska because he sees a hot dog stand at the airport that says Alaska Airlines. And it's like Alaska, where he is. So they get out, they get in a van, they drive off to a wilderness, the Alaskan wilderness. They trek a few miles to a lake and kind of settle in. And suddenly a materializes above them and starts draining water out of the lake. And that's the story. Oh, and lasers start off and blasting everything. And Ingo, rolls down the hill and gets into the cave, and eventually the lasers stop and the UFO disappears. And they say, "Hey, Ingo, did you sense anything?" "Well, no, I didn't sense anything. I was trying to escape from lasers." And they go, "Well, what do you think they wanted?" "Well, they wanted water. Didn't you see them suck up the? Need a psychic for this." But this is one of the wilder stories that gets talked about. And Ingo Swann, they tell him not to talk about any of it for 10 years. So he waits 20, then he publishes the book, which just released another edition, which included some special information, some additional information about Mars, apparently. Remember the bilocation? He didn't, his body didn't go. That happened in the 1980s, which they found, I believe, in the West Georgia Special Collections of Ingo Swann's papers, detailing some additional information about his remote viewings of Mars. And then another one of the remote viewers, Lynn Buchanan again, Sergeant Buchanan, he talks about how after he retired from the military in 1991, are we good on time? We're good. Okay. After he retired from the military in 1991, Lynn Buchanan reports actually asked to review files from, again, he won't tell you, intelligence agency, or I think all he says is just an agency. I'm assuming that it's an intelligence agency. He was asked to review secret files about extraterrestrials visiting Earth, just what was known about them, in order to determine the psychic abilities of each group. Apparently there's multiple. The report remains classified, but Lynn Buchanan can talk a little bit about it in these several interviews that discusses it to some degree. So that's just aliens get involved. What do you do with that? So the existence of the program, again, it was a top secret program between 1972 and 1995, or at least it was supposed to be. Apparently the existence of the program actually became fairly widely known in the 1980s. In the early 1980s, two scientists left Stargate, and they started talking, and they published about it, and they hit all of the talk show circuits, just spilling all of the beans on the program. So it kind of became widely known in the early to mid 1980s. But the government continued to deny everything until 1995, whenever they acknowledged the existence of the program, and it was immediately closed. But even then, in 1995, there's a lot of problems. Congress finds out because, again, it was officially acknowledged, and wants a what they spent how much on psychics for how long? We got to get to the bottom of this. So they, first of all, not all of the data is declassified yet. Admitted that they had been using psychics in 1995. They didn't release all of the documents in 1995. So they some of the documents in 1995, and they hired 2 statisticians to review these documents and determine about 80 of them, only from the research side, not from the operations. None of the operations were released, I don't believe, at this point. But the statisticians looked at just about 80 documents or so from the research side, and to write up a report about their findings. Did this work or not, is basically what they're asked. Both of the one of the statisticians says absolutely it worked. The other statistician says, you know, it does seem like there was an anomaly here, but we don't know how it works, and we don't know if it was useful based on what we see. The report, of course, says, you know, it didn't work. And that's what issued and entered into sort of the official story at this time. Well, both of statisticians both said that it did. So the report says that it didn't. And then one of the statisticians has been saying ever since, crying foul about the report and saying how bad it was. So it kind of gets really complicated from the legacy here, from the legacy perspective. And more complicated, they finally actually declassifying the materials. Ed donates the materials to Rice. This was just a couple of years ago. But in the early 2000s, from about 2000 to 2008, they released most of the documents. And if you look at the documents, there's just no way to say it didn't work. Apparently, the CIA was the ones who issued the report saying that it didn't work in 1995. So why do the documents say that they kept coming back over 100 times? You know, there's just a lot of problems. So it was deployed successfully thousands of times over 23 years. The US government, a lot of different agencies of the US government, collectively gave about $23 million to development over that time. Today, you can learn to do it yourself and hire someone to do it for you if you don't want to do that. There are private investigation services that now use remote as part of the package that they offer for getting to the bottom of whatever you want the bottom of. And again, a lot of the remote viewers who are trained by the military and intelligence agencies now have books and training courses where they will actually teach you the same stuff that you know, the DIA taught them. So it's really interesting stuff. And there's videos, books. So how does it work? The short answer is we don't know. They spent a lot of time to figure out how it works. No one ever really did. They came up with some pretty good ideas that are backed by some evidence. Though over the 23 years they were looking at it. One of those is called the extremely low frequency electromagnetic radiation hypothesis. So this is the idea that below a level that is detectable by things like, say, a Gauss meter, there is an electromagnetic field that permeates the known universe, and it carries some sort of data that our brains can register under, you know, meditative conditions and through remote viewing practices. This was really popular with the Soviet Union, not so much with the American side. The Americans say that they debunked this. hypothesis using Faraday cages and submarines. So a Faraday cage is just a device. It blocks electromagnetic radiation. You put a remote viewer in a Faraday cage, they can still do it just as well as they ever could. Submarines, apparently, if you go down far enough under the water, eventually your radios don't even work anymore. It blocks the electromagnetic radiation. Again, remote viewers still seem to be able to do what they do, even on a submarine. So, and they had access to that because the Navy gave them some money. So, you know, this doesn't seem to be accurate, except on one of the things that they noticed that they were looking for correlates to the psi functioning of the remote view was it seems to be negatively impacted. It seems like the remote viewers do a worse job on days whenever the geomagnetic radiation of the Earth is more than normal. So there might be some connection. There does seem to appear to be some connection to the geomagnetic frequency of the Earth. So there might be something going on with EM, but we really don't understand the connection. On the American side, several, not all, but several of the seem to go with the hyperdimensional hypothesis or extra dimensional hypothesis. So we typically interact 4 dimensions of our physical universe. Can you remember them all? And the math actually works out to 11, but we only interact with 4 typically. So the basic idea here goes back to flatland, if anyone's ever heard of this. If you can imagine a sheet of paper, which you have a little universe in this 2-dimensional sheet of paper, and the entities on it are say round or square. Well, they can only interact in 2 dimensions. So you, as a 3rd-dimensional entity, can come along and just kind of pick one up. And it'll look as though he's disappeared to all of his 2-dimensional compatriots. And he will have no way of understanding what's going on whenever you pick him up and show him his entire universe all at once. Whenever you put him back down, he's just not going to have any way of explaining that to his friends or really understanding what was going on, unless somehow he can work out that there's some other dimension of reality. Well, this is one of the ideas that gets tossed about by some, again, not all, some do disagree with this, but some of the scientists on the American side seem to think that this might be how remote viewing works. Some aspect of the human mind might be able to access the dimensions higher, which apparently the math works out to prove exist, higher than the 4 dimensions that we typically interact with during our lives. And if you go up to, say, number 5 or 7 or what have you, then you would be able to see or interact with aspects of the 4 that would otherwise be impossible if you were still caught in the 4. Much the 2-dimensional figure taken into a 3rd dimension could see all of the 2 dimensions at once. So 26 of dimensions are hypothesized by string theory, but a lot of people are saying that string theory might not work out. So we definitely know about 11. Yeah. What it does seem to prove, though, is that there is some aspect of the human mind which is not constrained by physical constraints that does seem to transcend the human body. Because again, the guy said he left his body at the Pentagon and flew over to walk around in the Kremlin. So there does seem to be some aspect of the mind that might be able to be projected might be able to somehow transcend what is known about the body. And we call this the filter thesis. The idea is that some of the researchers believe that humans intrinsically have access to all of the information about everything that has ever occurred in the entire universe, going back to the Big Bang, where we think it began. But if you were always experiencing all of that all of the time, you couldn't function. There would be no way for you to have daily life, and you would just be too overwhelmed by all of it. So the idea here is that the brain acts as sort of a filtering mechanism, filter out much of that information so that you can run, so it can be you on a day-to-day basis. There's a lot of spiritual concepts of various religions have the same idea going back thousands and thousands of years. Hal Puthoff, one of the scientists, actually the scientist who was there in the beginning, has actually written about this. And he puts forward that the subquantum field, so the quantum field, if I'm getting this right, I am not a physicist. If I'm remembering this right, the quantum field is that which collapses into matter, than everything you see. We've recently realized that there might be another field, the energy, that's more of an information field, telling the quantum field how to collapse. And Hal Puthoff has written about this. The 0-point energy field is one of the things he calls it. And he's written about how this sounds remarkably similar to traditional Asian philosophy concepts of life energy, such as prana or chi, from the Indian and the Chinese cultures, respectively, had kind of a similar concept. Voltaire calls this non-local mind because it does reveal some aspect of the human mind is not constrained by spatio-temporal locality. Are we done? Are we?
We've got about, let's see, 2 minutes, exactly 14 minutes.
Excellent. Well, we're going to skip over that. Talked about mostly. Who wants to try it? Get out a piece of paper. You don't want to try it? All right. So, while everybody's getting set up, idea here is that, first of all, you have to relax, which is really hard for some of us to do. But just try to calm down the best you can. Take a deep breath, and try to chill for a second. And once you seem to have turned off your inner log the best you can, start trying to pay attention to what might bubble up. But you don't want to go right away. You can later. One of the DVDs, it's really cool. But you don't want to go there today because that'll confuse. So at first, though, I want to focus on descriptions. Just simple 1, 2 descriptive words. And the reason for this is because your thinking mind is engaged with this material. We're trying to go there all at once. And it'll say, oh, wet, square, oh, it's a swimming pool. Well, not necessarily. It might just be a square cup of water. So your mind will start trying to conclusions if you try to focus on 1 to 2 words right off the bat. So just whenever 1 or 2 words kind of filters through to your consciousness, just write them down and then try to clear your mind again. Again, do the best you can. Wait for the next couple of words to come up. And at the very end, you're going to try to sketch the target. Just, my stick figures are bad, but maybe you're an artist. So just try to do the best you can. Just try to draw a little picture at the end. So the only thing that I'm going to tell you about the target is it is the coordinates. Write these down. Are 4, 2, 5, 7, 3, 8. And I'll show you the picture whenever.
All right. How's everybody? Need another second or raise your hand if you need another minute or two. Okay. All right. Everybody got a good feeling? Sure. Who did it? What? Oh, yeah, nice. Yeah, I'm not really sure about sunshine here. It's a black and white. They used National Geographic pictures for target practice, and this is from the Stargate archives. Yeah? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's about what would be expected out of a group this big, maybe one or two. Anybody else? Yeah. Well, you can all say that you did some remote viewing today. Some people would take, and this is another thing, and I'll leave on this. One of the things that they realized during the program pretty early on is that psychic abilities. They appear to be evenly distributed throughout the population, as much would other natural talents be, or other genetic traits, such as blue eyes, for example, would be a recessive genetic trait. See it, probably see it every day, but it's certainly not the majority. That's probably how psi ability too. But the other part of this is that it does seem to be an ability, a talent, much like every other. I, for one, am a nerdy type. I will never be a professional football player, as hard as I might try. But if I were to start working really hard right now and maybe hire like Dallas Cowboys best guy to train me, I might eventually learn to be able to throw a football. But it's a lot like that. Some people take more time, take more work. Some people just, it seems like they were just born to do remote viewing, just like Mozart was like like putting together piano pieces that are absolutely beautiful by the age of like 3. It's like that, or at least it appears to be like that. Some people may disagree with that, but I think that's how it is. I've heard a lot of talk about it like that. So thank you so much for listening today. And Dr. Glacier, do you have anything else?
Thank you, Chris.
I'll stick around for a few minutes if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, I think that's it. Of course, what Chris presented today, was fair game for the quiz. You guys know that. On top of the reading for the quiz. So the cryptids article, and then what Chris talked about today will be on the quiz this weekend. Otherwise, we're gonna spend this week and next week on cryptids and cryptozoology, and then we'll come back Tuesday. And I think, lucky for you guys, I think it'll just be me. So no guest lecture, we'll just do class like normal, probably do some small group work, discussion and so on and so forth. Okay? All right, guys, we'll have a good week. Take care. See you soon. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks
That was,
for letting me
that
come.
was brilliant.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially like the hands-on practical activity at the end
Yeah,
to get into to remote view like that.
yeah. Kind of brings it to life.
Yes.
Absolutely.
What's the-
My name's
Shemaya, I'll make sure I have you marked down.
Okay. And then, sorry, I was a little confused.